Good morning. I'm, as George said, Rhea Williams from E3 Platforms. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Dan Roberts, co-founder, co-CEO of the NASDAQ-listed IREN.
I love on your bio, it says that you bought high and sold low. Tell me a little bit about your background and what you're talking about.
That's referring to Bitcoin. So by way of a bit of a deeper introduction, background in banking, co-founded an infrastructure funds management business in Australia about 15 years ago. Right place, right time. We grew to around 6 billion of assets under management. So ports, airports, wind farms, solar farms, etc. And along the way, I discovered Bitcoin. I think it was 2014. I bought on the run up to $1,000 and it crashed to 500 and I thought, nonsense, silly magic internet money, sold it all. How wrong I was. So yeah, look, Bitcoin, I think it's a really interesting asset. It's a commodity, gold 2.0, the rest of the crypto ecosystem. I'll be polite and say maybe varying degrees of prospective use cases.
Fair enough. Making a big splash, obviously, I think everybody probably saw IREN as they walked in the door. It was 7 a.m. and it was Led Zeppelin playing and IREN on the main stage as I walked in. One of the things they want us to talk about is the transition of a lot of the Bitcoin and crypto providers moving into the data center and the AI space. We've seen, obviously, with Crusoe and Hut 8 and Applied Digital and now Riot. You guys have made this transition, but I remember back in my digital or NTT days when anybody from that space came and wanted to possibly use our facility for co-location. It was too resilient, too redundant, too expensive, and we essentially said, go find a warehouse and put a fan in it. And you had the foresight to build really, really differently. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So as I alluded to earlier, look, we're not crypto guys. In fact, I really can't stand the word. But back in 2018, my brother and I, Will, who's in the audience, our vision for the future was that we would need high-performance computing data centers. So we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, the digitization thematic of humanity. Our seed investor deck, we spoke about movies like The Matrix and Ready Player One. Like as society, we are moving into the cloud, and the legacy data center industry is just not built to service that demand. It's 80% of global data centers are 5 kilowatt or less rack density. We heard Dylan earlier talking about we're up to 200 now. So it's a fundamentally different asset class. They don't belong in metropolitan areas. It makes more sense to go to the source of low-cost, excess renewable energy, monetize it at the source, and export digital goods at the speed of light over fibre. So for us, it was a whole new asset class, these regional high-performance computing data centres, and the business plan was simple. Our thesis was that the real world would never keep up with the digital world. There's a fundamental dislocation there where the digital world is your demand driver, it's your revenue line. You've got adoption curves that are going vertical overnight, right? You have Bitcoin that didn't exist 15 years ago. Today it's gold 2.0 at a $2 trillion market cap. You had AI, which has been restricted to the hallways of PhDs for many, many decades, and all of a sudden over the last 18 months it's popped out of nowhere to be potentially one of the most society-defining technologies over the coming decades. But the real world can't scale exponentially, the law of large numbers. So for us, it was really simple. Use our expertise in infrastructure, data centers, and power, lock up a lot of power and energy, and build a high-performance computing data center platform, which we would bootstrap with Bitcoin mining. We don't hold Bitcoin, we mine it, we sell it every day. We're mining it at $35,000 a coin, we sell it at $110,000. It's a good business. But as a result, today we're sitting there with 810 megawatts of operating data centers that we're actively swapping out the Bitcoin mining racks and inserting NVIDIA GPUs to service AI cloud customers.
You guys have been in the news a lot lately. You've obviously made a very large purchase of those GPUs that are coming in. You've had a bit of a crystal ball already. Where do you see not just IREN going next, and you talked about these can't be in major metropolitan areas. Where do you see, as Virginia is full, you guys are in Texas, but we're seeing Texas is filling up. Where do you see things going next?
It's a great question, because at the end of the day, that was the opportunity to front run a lot of these grid connections. And we've got 3,000 megawatts of secured grid connected power that we use 100% renewables. We've got a long development pipeline, but undoubtedly it is getting harder to get these grid connected projects. And if you're not grid connected, you've got these issues, right? Because you go behind the meter, all of a sudden your data centre destiny is now in the hands of a gas power station, all the operating risk, the financing becomes more expensive. So it's really interesting, because arguably we're still in the first innings of this exponential demand equation for power and data centres, but we're seeing all these choke points everywhere.
You have obviously a finance background, and we've seen such an incredible insurgence of capital into this industry. We're talking about things in the trillions. It's really a bit hard to sort of wrap your brain around how much capital is coming into the industry, but I love to quote Will Smales, who was on stage with me last year, saying, "Bankers hate change," but this is all change. So how, from the sort of finance perspective, are you looking at this huge growth, huge change in the technology, and how are they underwriting everything that they're looking at and doing and building?
Yeah, I mean, the capital markets are forming, and in some ways that's the last piece that's required, because if there's customers, if there's revenue, if there's a use case for these assets, the capital will flow. And then it comes down to the nature of the capital that does flow and the way that people structure deals. And we were speaking off stage that there's a lot of different structures out there where people are building out the multi-gigawatt campuses, mobilising tens of billions of dollars of capital in one tranche to try and go quickly, all the way through to smaller levels of GPU financing. And we're fortunate to be listed. We've got good access to capital markets. We've recently secured 2 tranches of GPU financing, which were 100% of the GPU cost, structured as a lease agreement. So the capital's there, and again, it comes back to, have you got the ability to deploy and operate these clouds effectively, and have you got the customers to use it?
Speaking of customers, we're seeing, it appears that Oracle is now in business with absolutely everyone. They've signed deals with absolutely everyone, but they're not necessarily going to be the end user in all of these cases. They have the credit rating, Microsoft has the credit rating, but they're not necessarily the end user as well. We're seeing much smaller companies that maybe don't have that. And how are you looking at financing when you're not working directly with the hyperscaler, or if the hyperscaler is involved in the deal, but they're not necessarily who's writing the check?
Yeah, so obviously the financing varies for both. I mean, both of the tranches we've secured in the last 4 weeks have not been linked to specific customers, and I think that just goes to a growing acceptance and comfort that lenders have in this space, that there is a deep pool of users. So yes, we all know that the larger users, there's a cohort of probably half a dozen that dominate a lot of the headlines, but below that we're seeing a real wave of demand from the smaller levels of AI, researchers, startups, scale-ups, and starting to see that small amount of enterprise there. So the market is becoming deeper, and as it gets bigger, we anticipate it getting deeper as well.
You're building something called a neo cloud. What's a neo cloud?
Yeah, it's a good word, isn't it? So a neo cloud is essentially a provider that makes available AI optimized GPU workloads. So over a VPN, people can log in and use a cloud service. And I guess to some extent we are a neo cloud, but we're probably one of the few, if only, vertically integrated neo cloud. So while it is true that we're making available an AI optimized GPU cloud service, we also own everything. We're fully vertically integrated. We own the power connection, we own the land, we own the data centers, we own the cabling. It is end to end. And that's a real point of differentiation, because A, it allows us to deliver things at a cost level that is superior. We don't have co-location fees, for example. Performance is better. There's no latency in terms of services and ticket requests and when there's an issue, because you don't have to lodge a ticket with a data center provider. We are the data center provider, so we've got people on site 24/7, and I think that flexibility, that cost advantage is contributing to the rapid growth that we're seeing. But the final piece of the puzzle is we have 810 megawatts of operating data centres where we are actively going into them, taking out the rack of Bitcoin mining ASICs, putting it to the side, and installing NVIDIA Blackwells. So the ability to get that flywheel going and service demand in live time is, I guess, in stark contrast to an industry that is really struggling on the supply side.
Really struggling on the supply side, absolutely. And supply chain issues all across the industry and everything in supply chain and people. So talk to me a little bit about how you're approaching the talent and hiring people and bringing new people into the industry.
So it varies on the geography. So in British Columbia, we've got 3 sites in regional BC, 100% renewable, predominantly hydro. And what we've seen there is a classic transition from the analogue world to the digital world, in the sense they had a huge industrial base where they had all the pulp mills, the sawmills, servicing the old communication medium, and they've all shut down. And what that left was a lot of electrical infrastructure and a lot of unemployment in these regional towns. So we came into those towns, leveraged a lot of that existing electrical infrastructure, and rehired a lot of the local workforce. And there's general trades which are helpful, electricians, but ultimately we just went through a large-scale retraining program and trained these locals in data centre operations.
I think that's fantastic. I think the data centers have such a terrible reputation. I think we've done a terrible job of marketing who we are and what we do. And when we go into a local community, there's so much of that not in my backyard. And I think that real economic development is usually more centered around jobs. And so it sounds like you've been able to go into the community and work with them and make sure that you're providing those jobs. And we hear all the time that AI is going to be taking over people's jobs, but in fact, our industry is trying to provide those. So I think that's fantastic. We talked a little bit about the sort of changes in technology when we spoke on the phone last week, and how you're looking at with how quickly there's innovation when you're investing billions of dollars into this technology. How are you future-proofing so that it's not, obsolete in 2 years?
Well, that's a great question, because 2 years ago, I doubt any of us had any idea we'd be sitting here in this type of macro environment. In 2 years' time, I think it'll be the case again. And when you're dealing in the digital world, you're dealing with these exponential rates of change. There's so many unknown factors. So for us, when it comes down to it, ultimately we've got a quality asset base where we've got full control of the vertical stack end to end, and that allows us to provide a really good customer service. From a investment side of things, it's all about matching demand with supply. So yes, we've got 11,000 GPUs, majority of which are Blackwells. Yes, we're looking at scaling that up probably into the hundreds of thousands over the coming years, but ultimately it needs to be backed by customer demand. And yes, those chips will be obsolescent one day. When? No one knows. Everyone's guessing. We can look at the A100s. They were released 5.5 years ago, just as a reference point, and they're still earning revenue, because what you see is at the front end of the technology curve, you've got all these leading AI labs and startups that need the biggest and the best and the fastest chips to train their models. But as they become second generation, as they become third generation, there's all these other people in the world that want to use GPUs. I mean, you go onto AWS to spin up an instance, there's all sorts of generations of GPUs on there. So I think the use case just changes, the end market changes over time, but to sit here and say these things are going to be technologically redundant in 2 years, I think it's a bit of an aggressive position. Just history would suggest that they're going to last a bit longer. It's just the nature of the customer and the end use case is likely to evolve over time.
How are you addressing the rapid growth of density changes within the data center?
This has been front of our mind for 7 years now. So we built free air cooling 75 kilowatt rack density in British Columbia, and it was over-spec'd for many years. The H100s, H200s, they're closer to 40 kilowatt rack density. But we've always thought it's better to be a generation ahead in terms of rack density rather than a generation behind and catching up, because Again, when the genesis story of this business is we looked at global data centers. 80% of global data centers have 5 kilowatts or less rack density. And for those in the room, a rack is about a 6-foot high black container. So we said, never get caught out on rack density. We're building a liquid to chip data center or a couple of them in Childress, Texas at the moment. And it was originally spec'd to 200 kilowatt rack density, looking at the generations beyond Blackwell's. But as we've gone through the construction and late stage design process, we've had to build in the flexibility to throttle that back to 130, 140 kilowatts, because that's where the market is today. So look, I think it's really important, but as important is the quality of the interconnect within the data center and how tight the cluster is and how you optimise it. I think rack density is one thing, and it's also getting to the point where people are throwing around rack densities but actually starting to introduce apples and oranges. So you hear about 600 kilowatt rack density coming out, and then you realise, well, it's actually just 3 racks sitting next to each other. And so, well, hang on, that's really 200 kilowatt rack density. So anyway, it's just one of those things you've just got to watch and monitor, and it is one of the challenges in the industry when it comes to these long-term co-location deals that are being signed. Because ultimately, if you're a neocloud signing a co-location agreement, if you're a hyperscaler signing a co-location agreement, you're contracting for a piece of infrastructure for 10 to 15 years. But the GPU refresh cycle is likely to take place in 5 to 6 years, at which time we have no idea what Jensen's going to be producing. So what does that mean? You've got a contract for 130 kilowatt rack density co-location, but then you've got 10 years left on your contract and the new GPUs are now 200 kilowatts. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot to play out over time.
Do you think they will actually hit a megawatt per rack?
I don't know, I'd be guessing.
And why? I've had it explained to me a few times of understanding when these things are closer together, and I'm still constantly trying to learn and understand what's going on in the data center, as my role has always been the building, right? And understanding the resiliency and the redundancy of the building. I think that there's a lot of talk around what's next. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of us wondering kind of in the crystal ball what's going to be going on. What do you see coming? What do you think's not just fantastic news, but real? What do you see coming down the pipe?
Yeah, and I think we've heard Jensen say that the data centre is the new computer, right? And we've seen Moore's law in action over the years and chip density. And we saw it firsthand with Bitcoin mining ASICs. So when people tend to hear Bitcoin mining, they think, oh, Bitcoin, crypto. But at its core, it's a high-performance computing chip. It's an ASIC. It literally stands for an application-specific integrated circuit. And we will start seeing more of them in the AI industry as workloads become more and more specialised. They are just an application-specific circuit. So when you install them in the data centre, they've had a technological life cycle as well. So you go back 8 years when the first ones were released, they had sort of 140 nanometer gate width on the transistors. Now they're down to, I think, 8 nanometers. So the same concept then applies to the data center. The quicker you can get these GPUs talking to each other over shorter hops, the quicker all those GPUs can act as a giant brain rather than being spread out. So it's a bit like having the benefit of one giant brain rather than 10 small brains scattered around.
That's interesting. And as we're dealing with issues in supply chain, issues with power, do you see all of the companies and hyperscalers, do you see them starting to work together and maybe actually go back to traditional co-location and start being in one building and actually being part of that big computer?
So this is the dilemma, because ultimately it's a capital market and each of these corporates is looking out for their interests, right? So what you hear publicly is often different to what's happening behind closed doors. And you've also got this slight paradox where everyone's talking about the need for giant clusters that are adding a zero every couple of years in terms of the number of GPUs in them, but equally the power's getting harder and harder to find. So how do you actually put those two things together where you've got an operating model that can deliver these AI labs what they need in terms of building and developing the large frontier models. And this is where I think the networking infrastructure and that concept of connecting different parts of the brain really effectively becomes super important. So we've got a 2 gigawatt campus just west of Abilene, the current Stargate project in West Texas, and it's comprised of a 1.4 gigawatt site and a 600 megawatt site about 30 miles to the north. So we've already designed a dark fibre direct connect between the 2 campuses to effectively connect them in the digital world so that they're one giant brain. And I think that's where the narrative around this emerging AI data centre industry has taken some time to unfold, because everyone looks at these areas that are regional and in the middle of nowhere, but the physical world is fundamentally different to the, sorry, microphone issues, fundamentally different to the digital world. Mm-hmm. So yes, it might be 400 miles away from Dallas, which might feel like a reasonable distance. The physical world, that's the case, but in the digital world, we've got 6 millisecond round-trip latency to the major Dallas carrier hotels. There are 1,000 milliseconds in a second. For all intents and purposes, we're on the doorstep of that carrier hotel. We are adjacent, and I think that's taken people's mindsets a bit of time to adjust, just because they've come from this traditional data centre industry where the data centre has physically been located in metropolitan areas. The hyperscalers have had their availability zones, and that's just the way it is, so there must be a good reason.
100% agree. I remember someone asked me who was not in the industry, they're like, why is there so much data center in Virginia? I'm like, because everybody decided to go to Virginia and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and there really isn't a specific necessary reason that it has to be in Ashburn, Virginia, other than that's where everybody is. When we look at the latency and we talk about the difference between the inference that we're moving towards and the AI that we're doing now, do you think that latency is going to play a part of that? Is it going to need to be next door to something else?
So, I mean,
because it can't be anywhere.
Well, yeah, it can't be anywhere. I mean, anywhere is a big term. But we've got 3 data centres in regional British Columbia, up in Canada, right? We are doing training and inference from those facilities. It's 20, 30 millisecond latency. But what people don't appreciate is there is fibre everywhere. There is high-speed fibre everywhere. And if it doesn't come to your doorstep, it's actually not that difficult to pull additional cable to get it there. It's a bit of money, a little bit of time, but nothing compared to the power constraint. Mm-hmm. So I think, again, that's a narrative that's overblown. And when you step back and you think of it from a fundamental perspective, rather than being anchored to a narrative that's just persisted, there are 1,000 milliseconds in a second. How long do you sit there now waiting for your ChatGPT prompt to load, right? If you're waiting 50 milliseconds out of 1,000 milliseconds in a second, is that really the difference between a good inference site and not? So I would challenge it on that fundamental basis. And this was the whole opportunity that we saw 7 years ago, and it's almost like modern day aluminium smelting, in the sense that that industry was born out of the opportunity to take stranded cheap power, monetize it into a commodity and export that commodity. The difference here is you don't need to worry about big manufacturing in the middle of nowhere in the sense of big smelting. You don't need to worry about ports and shipping routes. All you're doing is producing a digital commodity at the source close to low-cost excess renewables and exporting that digital good at the speed of light across these fibre connectivity.
It's still a bit magic to me. I find fibre fascinating, and I don't really understand, and had to explain to my sister once that these cables run underneath the ocean, and I think there are a lot of people that don't understand the fantastical things that we do and the technology that we get to be a part of, and it's very exciting. We're just about out of time. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with everyone here?
No, thanks for having us, and thanks to George for allowing us to be a part of the event today.
Fantastic. Thank you for speaking with me.
Cheers.